Welcome to What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for pre-order on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today's podcast is the last of a trilogy on consciousness and time. My guest is Marc Wittmann, Ph.D. Marc is a research fellow at the Institute for Frontier Areas in Psychology and Mental Health in Freiburg, Germany. He studied psychology and philosophy at the Universities of Fribourg, Switzerland, and Munich, Germany. He received his Ph.D. at the Institute of Medical Psychology, University of Munich. From 2000 to 2004, he was head of the Generation Research Program, Tölz, University of Munich. Between 2004 to 2009, he was a research fellow in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego. In today's interview, we discuss Marc's book Altered States of Consciousness from MIT Press. We begin with a discussion of the history of psychedelic research. Then we move on to the central issue, the intimate relationship between time, consciousness, and the self. We look at the phenomenon of time expansion experiences in meditation. We touch upon a famous controversy on the nature of time between Albert Einstein and the philosopher Henri Bergson. We discuss the disturbing disintegration of the present moment in conditions like schizophrenia. And we finish by considering the implications of mystical states, which commonly feature a profound sense of unity with the cosmos. We're going to start with a very simple question, which is, how did you become interested in altered states of consciousness?
Everybody has experienced altered states of consciousness. Yeah? So if it's just the 3 beers you had in the pub, yeah? Think about sexual orgasm. Yeah? So in your life, you always, at some point, you experience altered states of consciousness. Yeah? And going more to the research side, I, for example, read a little book by John Lilly about the flotation tank experiences when I was in my early 20s or something. And then of course you experiment a little bit with drugs when you're young. I spent 1 week in a monastery in Bavaria and going to church early in the morning at 6 o'clock and sing with the monks. And so I did a lot of stuff just to experiment with, you could say, experiment with self-consciousness, with consciousness. And then in my academic career, I started with working on time perception. For example, how time perception changes with certain lesions to the brain after infarction to the brain, for example. So I did a neuropsychological work for my PhD. And at some point, then I was invited by Franz Vollenweider from Zurich, who is an eminent psychedelic researcher and who was the first person after Nixon, with his doctrine, forbid doing psychedelic research, to again start psychedelic research in Switzerland. There was a 90s, and I conducted a study with two studies with Franz Vollenweider around 2004, 2005 on psilocybin and time perception. And so that's how I basically also came into in academia, I came into contact with research on altered states of consciousness. And then in 2009, after 5 years of being in California at the University of California, San Diego, UCSD, I got a job here at the Institute of Frontier Areas of Psychology and Mental Health, where it's totally open with going in any directions, of studying consciousness and mind-matter relations. And that's where I'm now.
So that's presumably without some of the restrictions of more traditional academia. So is that, do you mind me asking, is that privately funded or?
Exactly. That's privately funded. It was funded in 1950 by Hans Bender, who was an eminent parapsychologist. And I will say he's the, let's say, most important parapsychologist in Germany. He founded this as a private institution, getting grant money to sort of establish the whole institute. And then at the same time, he was also professor at the University of Freiburg, and where you could say he actually had a professorship for parapsychology. It was called also, again, frontier areas, but he was explicitly doing parapsychological research also at the University of Freiburg. And this institute, some sort of at the university, was sort of shut down something around 1990 when he was long retired. But this institute still exists. It always existed in parallel, a privately funded institute of frontier areas of psychology and mental health. And that's where I am now.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yes, I know of Hans Bender's work. He did work on the Rosenheim poltergeist back in the 60s, didn't he?
It was I think his biggest research endeavor, analyzing
what
happened then.
I was also interested to hear that you were interested in John Lilly's work, because about just over 20 years ago, I became familiar with it, and I was reading up a lot about. He did a lot of work on dolphins. He invented flotation tanks, and actually, this was around the time I got to have a go in a flotation tank. There was a centre in Sussex, but it was quite an interesting experience. Although I have to admit that after about an hour, I just spent the time thinking I want to go to the toilets. But it was interesting.
Yes, and I can say so. Let's say even 30 years after I read John Lilly's books, I now installed my own flotation cabin here at the Institute in Freiburg, and I'm now doing research on flotation, which is something like my highlight or most thrilling research I'm doing at the moment, I think.
Because he actually dropped, was it LSD? And used flotation tanks, didn't he?
He meditated in the flotation tank under the influence of LSD, yes. So he combined it all.
So, I mean, that was interesting, because it's interesting you mentioned that these experiments, there was a wave of experimentation with psychedelics in the 1960s, wasn't there? And like you said, it was the Nixon administration. They really hammered down on it, and that was because of its association with the counterculture, wasn't it? They were kind of afraid of it in some ways.
Yeah, so they mixed everything together, so on this war on drugs, so to speak. And that's right. So it was also a political stance that they thought that it was just too dangerous, that people would, quoting Leary, drop out of society and be against society. And there was a Vietnam War and the protests against the Vietnam War, and it was just a really a chaotic time. And then research, but even research then was forbidden. So even you had institutions, academic institutions in the US, universities were doing research, and this all tempered out, and they at some point had to stop doing serious research. It's just now coming back.
That's so crucial, because I seem to remember the legislations tried to claim that these drugs like psychedelics, so we're talking psilocybin or LSD, had no medical benefits, and that's proven to be totally untrue, hasn't it?
Well, it's now what's now happening in England, in the US, but even now in Germany, there's the first big study now happening with patients with depression. So I think it's now really being seriously attempted to do clinical research with really qualitative studies with today's standards. And you could always argue in the 60s, maybe the standards were not as high as today. But of course, still you had positive results and with good and interesting research. But now you have really these clinical studies, and it's coming out, and there are just coming more and more studies out on patients with depression, with PTSD, etc., anxiety issues. And I think it'll take some time until it's really it will be established in the medical context, in a medical context, that let's say you could go to a university clinic, and then you're highly depressed, and you actually can get an LSD or psilocybin treatment in the context, of course, of psychotherapeutic intervention. And maybe in 10 years, 15 years, this will be actually just the standard.
Yes, I hope so. And I think particularly in the UK, that would require some legislative changes. But I think potentially from what I've seen, it's like you mentioned the Roland Griffiths experiments on psilocybin at Johns Hopkins in the noughties, and he actually came to give a talk to the Society for Psychical Research. So we got to hear firsthand how they've been testing that they started off with sort of people who weren't suffering from mental health issues, but then they moved to experiments with depression and alcoholism and stuff like that. So fantastic. So let's move on to your book. Really fascinating book, actually, Altered States of Consciousness. So you discuss these issues, but the focus is much more on foundational questions about basically the nature of time and self. So I thought what we do is work through the issues raised by the chapters. So we can start off the first chapters really on the sense of time and how time fluctuates according to really your state of consciousness. So why did you start off with the time expansion aspect of these experiences? What was it that particularly drew you to that?
So as I said previously, that I was basically trained as a neuropsychologist on the topic of time perception. Yeah? So what changes after brain damage to time perception? Yeah? And so the topic of time, you could say, is the red thread through all my career, what I was always doing. And then, as I said, with Franz Vollmeier, we did this study on time perception alterations in psychedelics, under the influence of psychedelics. But content-wise, I would say subjective time, is one of the phenomena that is one of the most important phenomena to describe altered states of consciousness. Yeah? So you can have time expansion experiences. Steve Taylor just wrote this book on time expansion experiences.
Yes.
Just came out, a fantastic book. And you can have time expansion, but you also can totally lose your sense of time. Yeah. So this feeling of timelessness, yeah, in peak states of altered states of consciousness. And what happens at the same time is not just subjective time, but also you lose your sense of self, your bodily self, but also your narrative self, yeah, the stories that you tell about yourself, who you are. And these go hand in hand. Yeah. So it's something like they're totally related to each other. And I think it would make sense if we look more into more familiar states of consciousness, like flow states, yeah? As contrasted, for example, to boredom states. So in boredom, for example, what you, of course, typically have, say, Sunday afternoon, you're not very motivated to do anything. You're sitting on your couch. You don't know what you want to do. And you feel yourself very much, your bodily self, your narrative self. You feel yourself very much, and time drags. Yeah? Or you're waiting for the bus. It's cold. You feel your bodily self very much. It's cold. You're hungry. You want to come. Why is this stupid bus not coming? And time slows down totally. So it's again, time and self are something related to each other. But then in flow states, and we did classic flow states whenever you're very motivated, you like to do something, you're good at what you're doing, and you're totally concentrated on what you're doing now, you lose your sense of self and time. We did this in a study with video games. Yeah, we had video game experience, so not so video game experienced people, and all on their levels of expertise, they all showed how the more flow states they experienced, as assessed with a questionnaire, a validated questionnaire on flow states, the faster time passed for them while they were playing video games, so in VR or in just on this computer screen. So you see boredom, flow, these two let's say extreme states you can have in daily, every day can have in daily life. They already show that how time and self are both up and down modulated. But they're now in altered states of consciousness, under the influence of drugs, in the flotation tank. Then this is even peak states. What people experience is something, this timelessness and selflessness. So I think for the descriptions of altered states of consciousness and for understanding consciousness in general, you need the factor of time. We need an understanding of what actually happens in the brain, of what we experience in these altered states of consciousness across time.
I think that's such a strong point, because I saw your talk, I think you gave last year to the Essentia Foundation on this. And when you were saying we've got to have time to understand consciousness properly, I thought that's so obvious, but it's been such a missing link in all these debates over what the nature of consciousness is. But I was so interested to hear about your flow of time, because I meditate and I teach meditation. And actually just last Wednesday, some of the people in my class were saying, oh, we think, because we do various kinds of meditation. So we do candle flame. We also do the breath, basic attention to the breath. So you're focusing on your body. But one of them said, my customers said, oh, well, I always expect it to drag, but it never drags, which to me says that they're quite focused on what they're doing, they've relaxed. But I found it quite interesting and perhaps a bit paradoxical, because in depression, obviously, I have some personal experience, time becomes muddy. I think you're right, it's got to do with that link to body sensations. But my question is that I think you touched on this a little bit in the book, is in meditation experiences, what you're looking in for is time expansion. So you are, rather than just being on automatic, you are focusing on what your body's doing, for example. But it's supposed to be and should and often is a pleasant experience. So, but you're still focusing on your body. So why is that pleasant, but being bored or depressed not pleasant?
Yeah, but that, of course, is related to the emotions and as you could also relaxation, emotions, etc. So you could say meditation, of course, is a state of relaxation, and so it's a positive feeling of your body, similar to the flotation tank. In this warm water, you're totally relaxing, you're letting go. So these are positive emotions, and in depression, of course, you have very negative emotions. So the bodily self is related to this negativity you feel, this horror, this catastrophe of your life. And that's, of course, total opposite to what you have in meditation. I mean, in meditation, it's also very interesting that a beginner of meditation, very often will also have this feeling of time dragging. You're just sitting there. Let's say your back hurts a bit, and you sit and you get a little bored, and I still have to sit for another 30 minutes, etc. So you also have these time dragging experiences, time expansion experiences in a more negative way. But let's say a beginner, an experienced meditator at the beginning of the meditation also will be very mindful on his body, and time will expand in a positive way, of course. But then at some point during the meditation, in at least very experienced meditators, what happens is then again this flip suddenly that you're not sensing yourself on time anymore. So this would even be something a sign of a successful meditation, that you really lost your sense of self and time. And that's what, for example, then meditators tell me, I meditated for 45 minutes and it felt like 5 minutes. So again, there you have time and self relate as one of the most prominent experiences in meditation.
That's so interesting. But I think what interests me is also partly you were talking about the link between time and bodily sensation, and essentially how the body provides us with sensory cues that help us to help maintain that sort of time sense. And this is one of the things that, having sort of read around this when I'm sort of meditating, I think you experience that time expansion, but the complete cessation of time I struggle with a bit. And partly it's because I can feel my breathing, I can feel the heart rate. So I'm thinking you can get past that, but a lot of the time, because you're still conscious of those sensations, you still have a sense of time.
Yeah. So that was my research at UCSD in San Diego, where I showed with fMRI technology that people who had to judge durations of many seconds intervals, that the insular cortex, insular activity, was most prominently related to the sense of time. And so the longer duration, the more activity in the insular cortex. And the insular cortex is the primary interoceptive cortex. So interoception meaning the feeling of your bodily self, the body signals coming up to the insula. So if you're cold, hot, if you're feeling pain, if you feel a little tickle, if you're hungry, thirsty, etc., these come from signals from the body up and are first of all, that's the primary interoceptive cortex, processed in the insula, and then furthermore integrated with all the other processing in the brain. And then I said, okay, but this means, of course, it makes some sort of sense because we don't have an inner clock ticking away or something for that we can measure time. So subjective time is based on our bodily feelings. So the accumulation of body signals over time. And so, yes, in meditation, then, for example, at the beginning, you're overly attending to your bodily self, the breathing in, the breathing out, or you're doing the body scan. So then you will have this time expansion experience. At the beginning. So this is, again, the relation from the groundwork you can think about in time perception research of insular cortex activity and even more recent research have shown how the heart rate is related to time perception. So directly the heart is related to time perception. The amplitude actually of the heart rate modulates our sense of time. And so this just shows very much how embodied subjective time is. And mindfulness meditation is a good example of where we experience that.
So my guess is if the amplitude of the heart rate sort of decreases, then that's when you get the time expansion experiences. Because if your heart beating a lot and noticeably, then you've got more of an anchor. But this is inspired by the work of A.D. Craig, isn't it? Who talked about we have a representation of time in the brain. And this is the other dimension that I found interesting, this link between time and space. And because you were sort of saying that we experience time as a kind of space, and it's a cognitive dimension. And the reason why I found that interesting was last summer again, I was, getting into the time thing, and I saw a lecture by the physicist Carlo Rovelli, who said that time is a creation of the human brain. And must admit, I'm still getting my head wrapped around the implications to that, because I think that comes back to some quite deep philosophical issues. So you mentioned Henri Bergson, but I don't think you mentioned that he actually had a big debate with Einstein on the nature of time in the 20s. So could you say a little bit about how you think the physics, time in physics might be related to your work on sort of subjective time?
Yeah, that's of course a very difficult question. How physics related to subjective time? But taking up, let's say, Henri Bergson's ideas, I think I'm very much sympathetic to his ideas because, and this is links to what Rovelli said, and Bergson basically said that time, first of all, is a primal impression that's just happening, becoming. So we constantly have this feeling of becoming, which you could say is very phenomenological, and you could say is very much dependent about what we feel. And that's, of course, emotions, and that's motions depending also on our bodily signals coming up. So it's a total dynamic thing. Yeah? First of all, at the first level, I would say it's not spatial, it's not space. Yeah? And that's what Henri Bergson always said, that how we see time is always this cognitive construction of space. Of course, we have, let's say, of René Descartes, the coordinate system, yeah, the x-axis is t for time, yeah, but that's of course already space, yeah. Then of course we could think about time like a ruler going from left to right. Of course, a ruler is measuring actually space, but actually we use it like a timeline. Yeah. Also, if you think about our week, it is 7 days, Monday on the left, Sunday on the right. Yeah. It's actually also cyclical, but you can even see it as a linear form of time. That's how we construct time. Yeah? And this is just, let's say, the second step. The first step is our immediate experience of becoming, of a dynamic unfolding of emotions, of consciousness over time. And that is what Henri Bergson said. And I think that is, I would say, with my neurophysiological work, is totally complementing this philosophical approach.
That's so fascinating, because at the time it was held that Einstein had sort of, inverted commas, won the debate, because I think it was a debate between his ideas that were related to relativity, wasn't it? I always thought, looking across that debate, that it wasn't either or. You can have complementary ideas about what time are. I mean, for me, Ravelli's statement sort of brought up all sorts of questions, like, okay, what, the universe has a past when there weren't any people around or even animals to observe it. Does that mean time didn't quite exist in the same way that it does when you've got to observe, all those really deep questions about the nature of reality?
Yeah, Canales wrote a very nice book about this debate, focusing on the debate of Einstein and Henri Bergson, and then surrounding this with the cultural, philosophical context of the time and Einstein's theory, Henri Bergson's theory. It's a highly recommended book read, because I think it's my favorite, basically, history of science book, actually, I read. I have to read it a second time now, I think. And what she basically also analyzes there is, funnily enough, for example, Henri Bergson, he talked for 45 minutes. Yeah? Actually, positively reflecting on Einstein's theories. Yeah, he was sympathetic to Einstein, but he just said that there's another sort of time, and that is subjective time. And he basically meant philosophical time. Yeah, but Einstein then, I think he just, probably because his French was also so bad, yeah, so he just talked for 3 minutes and basically crushed the whole scene in saying there is a physics of time, there's a psychology of time, but there's no philosophy of time. He said. So basically, he said, okay, forget Bergson. But what I wrote an article with Carlos Montemayor on this debate and surrounding the physics and philosophy and psychology of time. What we concluded was, Henri Bergson basically was, of course, he considered himself a philosopher of time. But if you think about Edmund Husserl, then about the phenomenology of time, yeah, with phenomenology, suddenly you have this link also to the psychology of time, because that's, of course, your first experiences are phenomenological. You have this feeling of time passage, and in analyzing this, and that is what, like Husserl later, on other phenomenological accounts, you are also actually already in an overlap with psychology. So Henri Bergson actually could have, let's say, responded that he's actually also doing psychology of time. So I'm happy that that Einstein said that there is actually a psychology of time. So me as a psychologist, I can continue working. But Bergson, I would also basically subsum under a phenomenology of time that he was doing. His ideas of this becoming, of this dynamics of time, are totally now embedded also in a psychology and an empirical work on subjective time.
It's so good that we've come back to Bergson, because he had a lot to say about consciousness, which I think has implications on some of the things we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's very good to hear you rehabilitate that. So I'll need to seek out that book that you mentioned and read the full debate, because I think that's such an inflection point. But I think it also showed where science was with studying things like consciousness back sort of 100 years ago. It was sort of very much still in the behaviorist mode. And I think it has as much to do with cultural fashion as
the
anything else.
Philosophy, of course, started right then. Yeah?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. Which made it quite difficult until much more recently. So let's move on slightly to talk about the present moment. And I found that interesting too, because you've basically say that naively with the present moment, it's just now, but actually in your book, you make a distinction between the functional moment, which is very short, the experience moment, which is about 3 seconds. And then you say there's sort of the mental presence. So could you explain a little bit how and why those distinctions exist, and why we think those distinctions exist?
Of course, so I'm building upon prior research and ideas, for example, of Ernst Pöppel, who was my professor, my mentor, and others, of course. And this functional moment idea, this label I gave, was based on my the work I did for my Ph.D. And this shows just we need a certain time interval between two events in the environment before we are able to tell the correct temporal order. There's around 30, 40 milliseconds. So you hear 2 clicks or 2 tones, tuck, tuck, or you see 2 time flashes of light. And to be able to say, oh, this was first, this was second, they have to be 30 minutes apart in time, 30 milliseconds apart in time. And this is the temporal order threshold. So meaning if these events follow each other in a shorter time frame, we're not able to tell them temporally apart. So that means basically this is the functional moment of where everything is integrated to a moment in time, subjective moment of time, because we cannot distinguish, which was first, which was second. So this is based on a very basic time frame, basically which our brain operates with. But then the experienced moment, the second one, is much broader. That's where we integrate many, many more different experience to produce a whole of experience which we feel as being now. And this is roughly something like around 3 seconds. Of course, our brain is like a biological system, so it's not exactly 3 seconds, but it can be somewhere between 1.5 seconds and 5 seconds or something. And this is basically a very interesting experimental task with us. For example, think of the metronome. Yeah, so we listen to the metronome. Yeah, the tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, and we can easily group these two ticks and tacks into one unit. But they are not tick tock. Yeah, there is not 1 2 1 2 1 2 in the outside world. Physically, the metronome is just a sequence of identical physical events. But nevertheless, we integrate them. That's what musicians use for their tempo. Physically, they're the same, but still mentally we group them into units. And we did experiments with that, showing that, let's say, if you slow down these the metronome beats, like tuck, tuck, at some point we can still 1 2 1 2 integrate them. But if the two come too far apart, we cannot integrate them anymore, meaning that this temporal platform of our brain, which integrates everything, cannot accommodate these two events which are too far apart in time. Let's say 3 seconds apart in time. So this means this is something like that's how we detected some sort of mechanism which basically automatically groups events in our experience into units which we of the present moment, which is related to our experience of the present moment as now. And so that's let's say is the experienced moment. So, and this also can be shown in language, in poems which have the is 3 seconds long. The lines of a verse, and but also in our communication now, we also what we do is chunk our meaning, what I'm now trying to say and what you're understanding, in chunks of 2 to 4 seconds, which can be shown experimentally, but also if one exaggerates a little, we can make little pauses in between our utterances, so we see that we actually, it's not a continuous line of utterances in our speech and in our speech or an understanding of speech, but it's all chunked into these 2 to 3 seconds units. So meaning also in coordination, in synchronization between two people, when we dance, when we speak, when we do music together, we basically experience the world and produce or behave in the world in these 3 seconds chunks. And that's the experience present right now, here and now.
That's so interesting, because naively you'd think, oh, well, it's just a moment. But then this really opens up the question, what exactly is a moment? The moment's having duration. For me, that potentially shifts quite a lot of things outside that perhaps.
We never experience a point in time. So even if I say out, the now already takes 300 milliseconds, a third of a second nearly. And so yes, everything we experience is always stretched over time. And to be meaningful stretched over time, we have to group all these events into units which are our experience now.
Yes, I mean, and you mentioned that in some mental health conditions like schizophrenia, that the perception of those metronome beats changes. So can you say a little bit about that?
In schizophrenia, what is being shown is that where let's say we have an overarching experience of a present moment stretching over 2-3 seconds as a whole, but patients with schizophrenia seem to be more compartmentalized in the experiences of shorter chunks now, and they lack this overarching experience, which is also the lack of overarching meaning. And that's why they all also very much seem disturbed in communication, in their experience of the world. You could say their world is in shards, temporal wise, because they don't have this overarching 3 seconds integration moment.
One of my favorite authors is the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, and he wrote a book called Martian Time Slip, and I think he was actually diagnosed schizophrenic. And it's essentially about these. I think there's a line, perhaps I think it's in that novel, that when you get a mental illness, nothing ever happens to you again, and it's all about this little boy who can see the whole scheme of his life. And I was thinking that this very much matches up with what you were describing in the temporal experience of schizophrenia. So again, that's quite a deep insight, that it is all about time, even if he was dealing with that in quite a metaphorical way.
Yeah, so these ideas, which are basically phenomenological ideas, have some sort of been lost over time. There was a Polish, Russian, French psychiatrist, Minkowski he's called, and he wrote about these phenomenological approaches to time. There is a German psychiatrist, Thomas Fuchs from Heidelberg. He also does research on the phenomenological aspects, which I was now just referring to. So I framed them now in these 3 seconds units. They maybe don't do this, but they still say this compatibility of the individual chunks they have, where they don't find this overarching meaning sense of a whole. And this is basically was derived from phenomenological research, really talking to the patients, not just doing experiments, computer experiments, as is very often done now, which of course complementary can also be now done with these ideas in mind to actually see, oh, if you have a metronome task, or if we have the famous ambiguous figures like the Necker cube, which also switch every 3 seconds, we can also do experiments now. But it all came from phenomenological analysis, also in following Henri Bergson's ideas. And then was Minkowski, who was following Henri Bergson, and Husserl in Germany. And it's now also, there's quite an overlap also in psychiatry now to use these ideas, as Kai Vogelay from the University of Cologne, who's working with patients with depression and also schizophrenia and autism, to seeing how their subjective time, really from interviews, phenomenological interviews, relates to their symptomatology.
Yes, that makes sense. I mean, I don't know whether you've read Ian McGilchrist's work on this in the hemisphericity, but he talks a lot about both schizophrenia and autism as sort of presenting the world in a particular kind of maybe mechanical way that's very drained of meaning, but it's also experienced on a moment by moment basis, and that means that meaning starts fragmenting, which suggests to me that meaning's got something to do with that integration, and if you haven't got that integration, then your meaning falls apart. So that's actually related to the opposite issue, which is, you obviously we talked about meditation and various other sort of practices on psilocybin, and these have been altered states have been associated with, say, wisdom traditions for thousands of years. So you actually start to touch on that. I was interested that you make a distinction between mysticism and religion. So could you just say a little bit about what the difference is? Because I think quite often they get lumped together, and how they might be significant in terms of altered states.
Well, we could say that mysticism and spirituality are is the basis or foundation basis for religions. Yeah, it's because people had spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, that religions were founded. But of course, then we know what happens with institutions. So if things become institutionalized, then you get jobs and you have power, and things change very much in these institutions. Actually, in parallel, similar, if you think about Marxism and socialism, at the beginning it was something they tried to sort of save the workers and peasants, but then it became the most gruesome, basically, ideology, killing millions of people. And so the same is if you think about religion. A lot of religions, let's say the Abrahamic religions, that the institutions, so you have the feeling they lose this sense of spirituality and mysticism. But actually, in Christian religion, but also in the Muslim religion, the prophets who had mystical experiences, were not very well accepted, and got punished and etc. And Meister Eckhart, he basically faced also a trial, because he had all these spiritual experiences and preached them and told about them, and the church was really trying to punish him, and luckily for him, he died of natural causes before he could be trialed. But you see, Meister Eckhart is one of the big mystics, of the Catholic Church. But then at the time, they didn't like that at all. So spirituality, because then you could also say, if you as a spiritual person have an experience, you have your experience as an individual. And this may be opposite to, let's say, the church doctrine. And that's, of course, why the church didn't like that, because you cannot control what people have in their experiences and what they talk about then. And so they were some sort of, punished. And spirituality, what you could say is one, let's say, way of definition is, of course, that you as an individual, again, and there we are now again back to the altered states of consciousness, which in a small sense, in a different context, transiently can experience in meditation, psychedelics, flotation cabin, is that you lose your sense of self, but not only this losing of sense of self, but you become one with the world. At the same time that you're timeless and you're one with the world. So time and space totally change. And that's, of course, what Meister Eckhart also in his was preaching, showing that in these states of his, what he called prayer, meditative prayer, he would feel aeons of time to happen at the same time. Yeah, so past and future were all one. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so meaning the spiritual experiences, basically, you could again look at them from this point of what is the sense of self and time and how it extremely changes.
Because I think for me, a lot of this is to do with the experiential dimension. I mean, I've personally experienced what you might call mystical experiences of occasionally of various degrees of intensity, sort of in the natural world. And there's a couple of other, an introvertive mystical experience in a different situation, which was quite intense, quite fleeting. And this is one of the things that interested me. It's that you've got this sense of not only timelessness, but that crucial idea that the self somehow dissolves so that you connect with everything else. Because I think the sense of self quite often isolates you from things. And for me, those experiences brought up some basic questions about the nature of reality, which I'll freely admit I don't know the answers to. But sometimes when I read, say, the neuroscience work on it, it's very interesting. But I sometimes have a sense that there's a tension between the idea that these experiences are probably completely brain generated, and then the idea that they might be telling us something about the deeper nature of reality. I mean, I did wonder what you thought of that, because you bring up this tension in psychedelic research. So you sort of say, are psychedelics just dangerous intoxicants that sort of zap our brains, or do they allow access to perhaps a broader reality? I mean, I did wonder what you actually thought, what you thought about which possibility is the right one.
I'm a little careful in doing statements on this. I oscillate also between the extremes. Yeah, so I'm curious, open-minded, and but in the end, maybe it doesn't matter so much for the individual who has had the experience. So, as let's say a brain researcher, you will always only look at the correlates of consciousness, or the neural correlates of consciousness, or neural correlates of altered states of consciousness. So you have, let's say, your brain measures with EEG or fMRI or whatever, and at the same time, the person has an experience. And this can be totally life-changing, self-transformative experiences. And being, let's say, for him in a totally different world. And that is actually what matters. And
Yes.
only that is actually what we should, not only, but that is what we should look at. And the other things in the brain are just these neural correlates, which are not the experience. They are not the experience. You have action potentials, and you can record and mass action potentials in synchrony, etc. But that is not the experience. That's just a correlate of the experience. So I would always say that actually the experience is much more important than what happens in the brain. So we had, for example, a very experienced meditator in the fMRI here in Freiburg at the University Clinic. That's in the working group of Stefan Schmidt and Lindrup Tillmann. He's a monk from Tibetan Buddhist monk who for 20-30 years was in France in a monastery, Tibetan monastery. And he's now back here in the Black Forest and has a meditation retreat center. And he also cooperates very often with us researchers. And he was in the scanner while he was meditating. And he's someone who really is for book, I interviewed him. And at the time, my book is already when I wrote it in German before it got translated into English, not in MIT Press. That was 10 years ago. He had something like over 50,000 hours of experience. Yeah? So probably he has now 60
That's a lot.
hours of experience. And it was 2019, we had him in the scanner, and he then said he got into this state, deepest state possible for him, a meditative state where there was no time, no self. Actually, at some point, there was, you could say, in our lay terms, there was nothingness, you could say. Yeah? And we recorded brain activity during that time. Yeah? And the interesting thing is in a further analysis with Cyril Costinus, where we probed him what actually happens in such a state, we came to the conclusion that the deepest state, there is actually nothingness. There is also no memory of what happened there. Yeah? You cannot report anything from the deepest state. Only when you come out of it and come back to a little more to consciousness, then you still have this feeling of where you came from. We can maybe imagine it that when we wake up, that we still have this feeling of, when we were deep asleep, but now we are already waking up. So this is transitory phase that is important. And from in this transitory space, still you could say, there was no self, no time, it was. Yeah? And what was the correlate of that was that in the posterior cingulate cortex, PCC, in relation to other brain regions, there was a decrease of activity and of connectivity to other brain regions. Activity connections with other brain regions were also reduced. So the PCC, the posterior cingulate cortex, is very much related to the narrative self. Yeah. So where we think about what happened yesterday or what in the past, what we will do in the future, or what we're just doing now, right now. This is the narrative self, this mind wandering going on. And that was completely, this activity was down-regulated, massively down-regulated. And that was the neural correlate of his, let's say, spiritual, mystical experience. And then you, of course, say, okay, now we know some sort of the correlate, or that this PCC reduction of activity. But of course, the experience he had, that is of course the most important. And so also so this was of course more technical, looking at how the narrative self, time is changed. But of course, if you have spiritual experiences where you become one with the world, where you feel bliss and you feel basically love, feel complete love to others, to the world, where you're connected with the world. Who cares whether the PCC is down-regulated?
Yes.
That's what matters. Yeah.
Is that is what you're talking about? Is that linked to the default mode network that seems to go down in psychedelic experience? I find that so very, very significant, because they were talking about that gets overactive in depression, doesn't it? So that's why these drugs might have an experience, psilocybin or whatever might have an experience on depression, because it stops that rumination.
Excessive deliberation on this excessive mind wandering is down-regulated,
But I think for me, ultimately, I think I'm a little bit like you. I end up being agnostic about the ultimate nature of a lot of these things, but open to the possibility of transpersonal experiences. I mean, with the course that I teach, we're actually discussing sort of some of these tensions last night, whether it can all be reduced just to brain function, or whether there is genuinely this transpersonal aspect. But I'm very sympathetic with William James's ideas in The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he says by their fruits, you don't judge an experience by their origin, which would be brain function, but you judge it by what it can bring to you. The pragmatic approach. I think there's an awful lot to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think reductionism in itself is already very silly, because what does it mean? It reduced to brain function. So reduced to brain function means that you just have, let's say, the recording of what happens in the brain. the molecular happenings, the electric happenings, magnetic happenings, all this together, yeah. But that's not the experience. So reduction is impossible even in everyday perception, yeah, because you always have your experience. It is always there. This in this most strongest reductionist sense, it would mean there is no experience. Yeah? There's only brain happenings, yeah? And that's of course complete silly, yeah? Because of course do we start with? Let's say at some point we didn't even know, humans didn't know that there was a brain. Yeah? We only had experience, yeah? And this will always remain. So reduction is impossible.
Yes, absolutely. And I was interested, though, that this feeds into another debate you touch on in the book, which is over near-death experiences. Because right now there's a sort of ferocious, well, I mean, it's been raging for at least as long as I've known about this, since the sort of late 80s, on the ultimate nature of near deaths. And so particularly there's debate over whether you could have a near-death experience with effectively a flatlined brain, or whether actually there's some residual activity going on there. And I think for me, quite often, again, I'm sympathetic with the idea that these are very powerful experiences. They're multidimensional, and that they have a transformative effect on the person. And you know, as far as our ideas like the afterlife are concerned, I think I ultimately don't know. There's a lot of ambiguity there. I don't think we're going to know that particularly till we actually pop off, and then we will know or not know. But do you think there's a sort of healthier way of navigating controversies like near-death experiences in a way that's sort of sympathetic, but takes on board whatever new things we learn about the brain? Because to me, that would be a more positive way forward.
When you talk about context you basically provide to someone who has such an experience. And I mean, that's basically what you would always do with any experience, yeah, being a strange meditative experience, yeah, the near-death experience, of course. But even, let's say, if you here in our Institute of Frontiers and Mental Health, of Psychology and Mental Health, we have also a counseling department where people have had paranormal experiences and don't know what to do with this, yeah. They had some, let's say, a strong precognition, yeah, a dream precognition, or a massive synchronistic event, or they experienced something like a ghost in the house, etc. Yeah, and of course, this standpoint from the psychologist there is, of course, not to debate the ontological status of that. Huh?
Yeah,
but just to, the first thing actually that people find already comforting is that when they learn that many other people also have these experiences, yeah, but it's actually not that rare or seldom. It's actually what many people experience. That's already the first step. Huh? So with all these strange experiences, one could say you always have to have a neutral stance if you're trying to give the context for the person. But then you could, if it was a very positive experience, then you, of course, can just try and help the person to integrate this positive experience into everyday life. And this is, of course, the self-transformation, which is not easy. So if you had, let's say, you led a normal life before, and let's say on Saturday, you went to your football club, and then later into the pub with your friends, and then normally in evenings you watch your favorite TV shows. You just have this norm everywhere. I also like to go to football stadiums, I will have to say, but I'm just trying to describe sort of normal life, yeah. And now suddenly you have a completely mind-altering experience, yeah, where suddenly a lot of these everyday normal, used to be normal things don't matter anymore. Yeah, you don't have to read your daily newspaper because these little things happening maybe are not so important for you anymore. You have a totally different attitude to life. Yeah, this is actually, or even, let's say, going to your job where you have, let's say, where you suddenly realize that you have a meaningless job. You're just doing something just for earning money. Yeah? But still, you have to earn money because let's say you have a family. Huh? So then this is really a thing, a challenge for integrating this self transformation into your everyday life.
Yeah, yes, 100%. And I think personally, I increasingly take a pluralistic approach to. I think I'm a bit of a epistemological pluralist in that I tend to try and take multiple perspectives. And because I found that useful with a lot of this material, it's like I was reading a book called Plant Teachers, which was co-written by Jeremy Narby and a tobacco and ayahuasca shaman. And it's fascinating because it alternates chapters. So one chapter is on the biomedical dimensions, and then the next chapter is on what the shaman thinks was going on, and there's such different worldviews. But what I really admire about that is they make a concerted effort to try and say, how can we put this stuff together? How can we have a respectful space where both these perspectives are honoured? And yes, I think we're sort of coming up to the hour. So could you tell me a little bit about your current sort of what you're currently working on? Do we have another book in the pipeline, or?
Yeah, it's always in the back of my mind, but it's funny that somebody basically the book it would come out at some point. Yeah, at some point I would just know. Now I write it down. Yeah, it's basically something is happening in the back of my mind, and I don't know about it. And at some point I will just know when I start. Yeah, I have some ideas and so, but it's not ripe yet. Yeah, but as I said, so my the thing I really like most at the moment is my research with the floating cabin. Yeah? And in fact, I'm happy it's not a floating tank, yeah? which can be quite scary for some participants. Yeah, if the lid comes close to you, to your face, and you feel you're like in a coffin or so. But I have a really nice flotation cabin. It's actually called Cabin for Two. And by an English producer. And I bought this because I had this overhead money from a EU study, and I bought it then with this overhead money. And we already published one paper, the very first paper, a quantitative study on the experiences people have, where with Helena Ruby, she's my doctoral student, and Stefan Schmidt and Justin Feinstein, whom I know. And Justin Feinstein is one of the most important floating researchers in the world. He's now in Hawaii. And I knew him from my San Diego time, so we never lost contact. And then I went to Tulsa, where they built a floating environment for research purposes. I learned how they're doing it there. And then when I got the money, this overhead money, I got my own floating cabin. And just to link it to what we're just talking about, the main results of this very first study we have now published is that people in the floating tank versus a control condition where they're on a waterbed in a dark room. It's a waterbed, meaning it's also warm. They don't hear anything. They don't see anything, like in the flotation cabin where they don't hear anything. They don't see anything, but they are in this warm, with salt saturated water to body temperature, actually skin temperature, 35 degrees. And what people there experience relative to this control condition, the waterbed condition, is that they lose their sense of body boundaries and they get into this time distortion. And time distortion, they don't know anymore. Was it short? Was it long? They don't lose their sense of time, passage of time and duration. And this correlates with an inventory assessing altered states of consciousness. So distortion of time and losing the sense of body boundaries, but becoming one with the world in essence, and losing the sense of time is basically a sign of altered states of consciousness. So that is what we could show. And so now we're conducting other studies of what we call the afterglow effect, similar to the afterglow effect with psychedelics, with Iraklis Pantazis. So we're looking at these because when you step out of the floating cabin and you suddenly change, and this you feel very much mindfully in the present moment, and you feel very relaxed. And we also assessed now this experience, and now also doing qualitative studies with interviews, what people experience in the flotation tank, to relate to darkness and gravity, the loss of feeling of gravity, of course. And so So these are all the things I like to do. And then even going into transpersonal things, can people connect through when they're in the flotation tank? Can the people connect to other people? So that could also be anomalistic research. And this is all starting now. So that's my most important work, I would say.
Oh, yes. Well, one of my colleagues, Cal Cooper at the University of Northampton, has actually, I think they've done a variation on the Ganzfeld telepathy experiments in a flotation tank.
Kirsty Allen, she's the PhD student there, and she's doing it with telepathy in the flotation tank. So she's doing this is the very first, basically, a systematic study with a lot of subjects, and it's just happening right now. Yeah.
Oh, that's really, really interesting, because the Ganzfeld that's always interested me. I was able to watch some of the experiments in Northampton a while ago, and it's always been the sort of the flagship of parapsychology, hasn't it? Because it's been the most persistent. So I do hope your experiments are successful, but I'll definitely await further development in this, because I think time, the self, it's such a crucial component of consciousness. And I think your work is really fascinating, and I look forward to hearing more results.
I mean, I also, in conversation with Donna Thomas, for example, which I find is a very interesting complementary approach with working with children, because these children don't have all these cognitive constructs of what might be or why not be, but they just have the experience, full stop. Yeah? And they also basically transcend time and space. Yeah? Very similar to what I'm trying to induce in adults with a flotation cabin, and she's doing there also research on near-death experiences in children, but also in other experiences they can have spontaneously in their life. And I think we can all put these different things together with work as Donna Thomas is doing, with working with children in their spontaneous experiences. And then on the other side, the work of Chris Rowe, for example, with the Ganzfeld, or with flotation tank, Kirsty Allen and my flotation tank research, where we try to induce it. And then these are all complementary approaches, which I think very, very important.
Yes, I do too. I mean, one of the earlier interviews for this season was with a skeptic who's tried several parapsychology experiments and never got any results. And understandably, this makes him, well, skeptical. But for me, what we're dealing with are quite subtle effects, and they could very easily be wiped out by, like you said, sort of adult cognitive, busy brains. I mean, from the skeptical point of view, that looks like an excuse, but to me, it's consistent with the spontaneous experiences where people, altered states of consciousness and psi experiences go hand in hand. So again, I'll be very interested to see what you find.
Yeah, I think this is two. You're totally right. We have these two possible approaches. One is the spontaneous experiences, but of course we don't have the control of the laboratory, of course. But still, then they happen. And the other thing is in the laboratory, and then it is very difficult to get effects. And that's probably your skeptic probably had problems with getting these effects if you do normal computerized, let's say, precognition tasks. Yeah.
That was exactly what he was
rhyming or something that Daryl Bem, for example, did. I also replicated it here with a German replication with Julio Mospers and Daryl Bem, and we got some sort of mixed results. But a lot of people don't get results, and that is my hypothesis now. What I'm working on is it's not enough to get people from somewhere where they just come from university, the students coming into the lab, and now suddenly they should have develop these precognitive abilities or have this precognitive experience. What you still need is getting people in the lab into altered states of consciousness. You have losing their sense of self and time. And for example, that was the approach with the Ganzfeld, of course, but even more so maybe and more powerful, for example, through flotation. And of course, if it's possible at some point, also with psychedelics.
Yeah, I think this is so important. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the small precognitive effects that Daryl Bem, because that was exactly what we were talking about. It was with Chris French actually, and he pointed to the massive transparent side project, which had used subjects in a rational analytical state of consciousness, and they'd got null results. And he was saying, well, this proves the effect doesn't exist. But from my perspective, the more I read about how and where these phenomena manifest, it isn't in an ordinary waking state of consciousness. Like, even if there's an effect there, I could easily imagine it being fogged out.
Exactly. So you need either it just happens to you because you are sort of in an emotional situation in life, yeah? Or if you want to induce it, and you have these small effects, but you have to get people into these altered states where they're receptive for these experiences, for these effects. These are the two, I think, basic perspectives or approaches we can do. And that's basically, actually, I'm doing now both approaches in my future work.
Well, I'm so glad that you moved into that field, because I think it's quite an achievement to get a book like Altered States of Consciousness published by the MIT Press. I think that perhaps shows an encouraging thing about how the culture's shifted.
Yeah, but of course, except for some little footnotes, yeah, I didn't go into the most frontier areas of frontier psychology. Yeah, let's say anomalistic experiences. But that was also at the time because I was basically doing, you could say, mainstream altered states of consciousness research. Yeah, but already this was already a step forward. I think the first maybe at MIT Press in this context. But let's say the next step will be more interesting, maybe.
I think so. I mean, what I like about your work is how it combines mainstream cognitive science with these alternative things in a very, very constructive and dynamic way. And I think when I was, I did my doctorate 20 years ago at Sussex, very mainstream. And I was also interested in psychical research and parapsychology. And it was like mixing chalk and cheese. And it was like they were two completely different topics. But actually, for me, they're all related to consciousness. And they're all related to consciousness. And these studies we're doing, they invite such fascinating questions about the nature of space, time, reality, self. What's not to like, really. Anyway, Mark, that was such a fascinating talk. I won't lie.
Was it a pleasure talking to you?
Yes, it was great. And to be honest, I'd love an opportunity to try some Gansfeld in the flotation.
Oh yeah.
But maybe. Anyway, so yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.
What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. What Lies Beyond the book is now available to pre-order on Amazon and other retailers.